And so now it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed speakers for this evening, Drs. Cordula Dick-Muehlke and Dr. Malcolm Dick. Dr. Cordula Dick-Muehlke is a consultant in aging and dementia and licensed psychologist. Over the past 33 years, she has dedicated her career to bettering the lives of people with dementia and their families. Dr. Dick-Muehlke is affiliated with UCI Mind, the UCI Department of Family Medicine, Division of Geriatric Medicine and Gerontology, and New Theological Seminary of the West. She currently serves on the board of directors of the California Culture Coalition for Person-Centered Care. Dr. Malcolm Dick is a licensed psychologist, has nearly 33 years of experience in working with dementia patients and their families as well. He is the chief neuropsychologist and a project scientist at UCI Mind's Alzheimer's Disease Research Center. In addition to evaluating patients, Dr. Dick pursues research investigating motor learning in Alzheimer's disease and neuropsychological assessment of dementia in persons of minority background. So please join me in welcoming our doctors and speakers for this evening.
Good evening, everybody. It's good to be with you tonight. I got to see if this is picking up my voice, actually. Does it sound like it's picking up my voice? All right. As you can see, this evening we're going to be talking about identification, treatment, prevention, and bringing you up to date on the latest information. Okay, you already heard about us, so here it is again. We have no disclosures. All right, now we're going to have a little fun. Oops, now I have to watch the mic. Now we're going to have a little fun and see if we can identify these individuals on this slide who all have died of Alzheimer's disease, except there's one remaining living individual. So let's go across the top and start easy. So Reagan. You'll have to shout it out because I didn't hear what that was. No, actually, that's incorrect. There you go, thank you. Who's that, everyone? Yeah, that's right. That's Hawaii 5-0. Jack Lord, good. And here, do we recall who this is? Thank you, whoever turned down the lights. Yes, that's right. Pat Summit, the coach from Kentucky. Perry Coma, I heard it. How about right here? Yes, right. Then we're going to go down, and who is this? That's right. And here, how about this one? Can you recognize him? Yes, really good. Burgess Meredith, you got it. All right. Charles Bronson, I heard that. We're going to wrap around here. Columbo, who is that? Yes, Peter Falk. Who's this? The mother of Samantha in Bewitched. Oh. Yeah. She has a name that's maybe not as well known, and I'm looking for it myself. It's Mabel Albertson. Mabel Albertson. All right, and then, and here? Who is that? Saturday Evening Post? Norman Rockwell, right. And here? Sugar Ray, yes. And here? Scotty. So does anybody know Scotty's name? James Doohan. And up here? Jimmy Stewart. Who's that? Jean Berry, good. And right down here? Arlene Francis. And the only still living person with Alzheimer's disease here?
Glenn Campbell.
Yeah, Glenn Campbell. who we're all following the journey of, and whose last record's going to be released in June, or has been released. Adios. All right. This is the latest data from the Alzheimer's Association about the number of individuals in the United States affected by Alzheimer's dementia. So I want to make a point here that we know that there are 5.5 million Americans affected by Alzheimer's dementia. Something that you're going to learn about today is that Alzheimer's disease actually starts long before it evolves into the phase of dementia that you're also familiar with when the person is having significant difficulties in functioning. So these are individuals who have reached that dementia stage. To me, one of the most impressive numbers on this slide is always the number of caregivers, 15.9 million caregivers. What does that mean? That means there are 3 caregivers for every one individual with Alzheimer's disease, 3 close family members or friends that are involved in the person's care. And today, a new case develops every 66 seconds. That means that 480,000 people in the United States will develop Alzheimer's disease this year. And we're going to be coming back to the statistic on causes of death in just a moment. You can see across the United States, all age groups, it's the 6th leading cause.
This slide, can you hear me okay? Okay. Well, this slide sort of shows the projected number of Alzheimer's patients in the United States between now and 2050. And this black line shows the total numbers, so we're a little over 5 million right now, but by 2050, with the aging of the baby boomers and everyone else, we're going to reach somewhere around 13 to as high as 16 million cases, or a tripling of the number of cases, unless some new treatments or preventions are found. And one of the interesting facts to look at is that of these cases, 2 out of 3 are women. This slide shows how California is affected in terms of the demographics. And interestingly, in the United States, roughly 1 out of every 10 Alzheimer's patients lives in California. In Orange County, the 2017 Alzheimer's Disease Association facts and figures said that there's essentially 51,000 Alzheimer's patients with dementia in Orange County. And in California, currently the number is 630,000, but within the next few years, by 2025, the number will go to 840,000. And by 2050, it'll be well over 1 million cases of Alzheimer's patients just in California alone.
You know, we're also really pleased that there's been a large increase in NIH funding for Alzheimer's disease research. Because what you can see on this slide, when we look since 2000, the year 2000 through 2014, that the number of people dying due to Alzheimer's disease has increased dramatically. That's 89%, as compared to the number of people dying from other diseases, other common diseases, breast cancer, prostate cancer, heart disease, stroke, HIV. We've made far more advances in the treatment of those diseases than we have with Alzheimer's disease.
When you talk about mortality in Alzheimer's disease, it's been probably underestimated for decades the number of people who actually pass away from Alzheimer's. And one of the reasons is that until quite recently, when you looked at death certificates, the requirement was that you had to put the primary or immediate cause of death. So for example, you could have someone who has gone through a long history of Alzheimer's disease, and they end up in a nursing home, unable to communicate, unable to walk, and they develop pneumonia, and they pass away from pneumonia. And so the death certificate would say death was due to pneumonia. And so they wouldn't count the fact that the reason the lady died from pneumonia was that she had advanced Alzheimer's disease. So when the Center for Disease Control in 2013 added up the number of cases where death was listed as the primary cause, it turned out that Alzheimer's was the fifth leading cause. There was about 85,000 individuals who died from Alzheimer's that year. But just as a case I just illustrated, people can die from various disorders, infections, pneumonia, falls, who have Alzheimer's disease. And Alzheimer's would be sort of really the cause, but it was something that was going on at the time. When you look at the number of people who die with Alzheimer's disease, so they may have some other cause of death, but they had Alzheimer's, then the numbers goes to 700,000 who are estimated to die with Alzheimer's disease in 2017. So you can see how you count the deaths makes a big difference. So essentially, the statistics say that 1 in 3 people, 1 in 3 seniors who die in a given year will die with Alzheimer's disease.
So I want to get back to those statistics of caregivers from the Alzheimer's Association again. You can see that number I mentioned earlier there under the United States. There are 15.9 million caregivers here in California. There are 1.6 million. And as we look across those lines, we can see that we rely on families to provide the majority of care for people with Alzheimer's disease. Look at here in California, 1.8 billion hours of unpaid care valued at $23 billion. And across the United States, 18 billion hours of unpaid care valued at $230 billion. Now there's also one other very, very important fact up there is caregivers do suffer or are more susceptible to both mental and physical health problems because of the stress of caregiving. So if you look on that last column, you can see that caregivers have higher healthcare costs, significantly higher healthcare costs. Almost $1 billion in California and $10.8 billion across the United States. And so let's switch now to the risk factors for Alzheimer's disease a little bit. And just mention, and we'll be coming to back to some of this later, but just mention there are really 2 kinds of risk factors. There's risk factors that we can't change, and there's risk factors that we can do something about. And, you know, it's the old nature versus nurture debate. So in terms of the risk factors we can't do anything about, the older you get, the more likely you are to have Alzheimer's disease. There are also some susceptibility genes, genes that increase your risk for Alzheimer's disease we'll be speaking about. If you have a first-degree relative, and that means either a parent or a sibling with Alzheimer's disease, it doubles your risk. If you're a woman, you already saw Malcolm mention that 2 out of 3 Americans with Alzheimer's disease are women. And finally, all individuals with Down syndrome develop the neuropathological changes in the brain of Alzheimer's disease, and many of them also develop the clinical symptoms. On the other side, there is a lot we can do, and we're going to be talking about these things later in the presentation, so I'm just going to mention that we want to control major health conditions, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and also live a brain-healthy lifestyle. As this slide shows, the number of, or proportion of people with Alzheimer's disease increases dramatically as we age, from about 3% of people in that 65 to 74 age bracket, jumping up to 17% in individuals 75 to 84, and up to 32% in persons 85 plus. In fact, some studies suggest that as many as 1 out of 2 people age 85 plus are affected by Alzheimer's disease.
Well, a lot of you are sort of just sitting there and say, well, what do these numbers mean? And one way to give a meaning to it is to look at an individual's lifetime risk. And lifetime risk is essentially the probability that someone at a given age will develop a condition during the remaining portion of their life. Excuse me. And this slide shows the difference between men and women. So, for example, a healthy woman or man at age 45, the risk of that woman developing Alzheimer's disease during the remaining portion of her life is essentially 19.5%, or 1 in 5. A woman 65 who's healthy, it has about the same risk, 1 out of every 5. And compare that to men, where a healthy man at age 45 or at 65 has about a 1 in 10 chance, or 10%. So clearly, women have a greater risk. Why is that? Well, for a long time it was thought that the reason that women are at a greater risk is that they live longer. The men, the good, die young. But we now know there's other factors besides just longevity. So the average life expectancy in 2016 for a woman is roughly 81, 82. For a man, it's about 76. So age does play a role in that. There's going to be more women in the older age groups, and so you're going to have more of them develop dementia and Alzheimer's disease. But there's other factors that we'll talk about as we go in. One of them is genetics, and another is lifestyle. And we'll get to those factors a little later.
So right now we are going to mention a little bit about genetics. We want to talk about 2 different types of genes. One type is deterministic, and that's the type of gene where if you have it, then you will develop Alzheimer's disease. And then there's another type of gene which is considered a susceptibility gene, which means if you have the gene, you're at greater risk. So if we look here on this slide, the 4 genes that have been associated with Alzheimer's disease, 3 of them are deterministic. But look at that, all 3 only account for about 1 to 2% of all cases of Alzheimer's disease. And if you have that particular gene, you're likely to get the disease at a younger age. The age of onset will be younger. Now, the one major susceptibility gene is ApoE4 that can increase your risk. And you can see here that depending on the studies, anywhere from 30 to 60% of Alzheimer's disease can be tied to that gene. And that increases your susceptibility for Alzheimer's disease after age 65. So an important point here is that you could have the ApoE4 gene and never develop Alzheimer's disease. You could also not have the gene and develop Alzheimer's disease. So it's not deterministic. Whoops, just a minute.
So let's talk a little bit more about the ApoE gene. And this is a gene that we all carry. It comes in 3 variants, ApoE2, 3, and 4. And so every one of us in this room has one of these 6 variants. E2 is relatively uncommon. And in fact, since you get one gene, one of these variants from each of your parents, so you could have a 2 from your mother and a 2 from your father, or a 2 from a mother and 3 from your father, etc. The E2 is relatively rare. In fact, having a double E2 is only seen in about 0.5% of the general population. Most of us carry a 3-3. In fact, it's seen in about over 50%, about 61% have a 3-3. E4 is the one associated with Alzheimer's disease, and it occurs in about 25% of the population. And having a double E4 is quite rare. It only affects about 2%. But as Cordula mentioned, although this occurs in about 25% of the population, also it's seen in about 30 to 60% of Alzheimer's patients. So what does having an ApoE4 mean? Well, if you're a carrier and you have one of those ApoE4s, it essentially increases the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease 4 times. If you happen to have a double E4, 2 E4s, the increased risk is about 10 times compared to someone who doesn't have E4. So this does suggest that you are at an increased risk. Now this ApoE4 test is something you can get from your doctor. I don't know if you've seen commercials on TV for 23andMe, where you can essentially spit into a tube and you send it in and they will give you some genetic results. Well, one of the 10 genetic results that they will send you is your ApoE4 status. Would we recommend you do that? Well, not really, because as Cordula told you, about half or more of Alzheimer's patients don't carry an E4. And you have to ask yourself, what would you do differently if you knew you had an E4? We don't have a cure for Alzheimer's. We have ways that we can prevent us from getting the disease, and you can do those preventions right now. You don't have to wait until you get your ApoE4 results. The other problem is that if you have had genetic testing, it might limit your ability to get certain kinds of insurance, like long-term care or disability insurance. There are federal laws that prohibit people from discriminating against you for your genetic background in terms of employment and getting health insurance. But these other kinds, disability and long-term care, there's no law that says they couldn't use that to exclude you from getting it.
All right, now we're going to shift gears and talk about what specifically happens in Alzheimer's disease in the brain.
So this is just a illustration of the brain, and usually I like to bring my brain, which is plastic.
I can hold that for you.
No, it's okay.
Because lots to juggle.
I can
I want to see how he's
multitask.
going to juggle this.
So we use this model of the human brain, and this model is about twice the size of a real brain. A real brain's more about the size of a medium cauliflower. And although the brain is small, it's only about 2% of our total body weight. It's a tremendously complex organ, more advanced than any computer. In fact, in that cauliflower-sized structure, we have around 100 billion, with a B, neurons, or brain cells. And each one of those 100 billion cells can contact as many as 7,000 other cells, so you end up having around 100 trillion connections. So the purpose of this model is just to show some of the areas that are affected in Alzheimer's disease. And one of the areas that is affected is this region that lies just sort of below where your ears are, right about here. And this region, which I'll illustrate on the cartoon, It is the area of the brain called the temporal lobe, and the temporal lobe is crucial for the learning and formation of new memories. And we have a left temporal lobe, which is involved in verbal memories, and the right temporal lobe, which is involved in nonverbal, like memory for people's faces or musical sounds or pictures. And there's a structure within this temporal lobe, it's called the hippocampus, and the hippocampus is an area affected very early in Alzheimer's disease. And the hippocampus, you can think of it as sort of your memory storage center. And so if that's an area that goes early, then the earliest symptoms you'll see in Alzheimer's disease will be memory problems.
All right, well, this is an illustration actually of healthy brain cells or neurons on the left and damaged cells on the right. So, as Malcolm said, you can see how each one of these cells, if we just use my hands as an illustration, each one of these cells has a large cell body and it has branches that come out from that cell body. So you can see that right here. And then if my other hand were another cell, as Malcolm said, they will come up close to each other, but they actually don't touch. There's a gap in between them. And that's where Malcolm was saying there's 100 trillion of these little gaps called synapses. And an electrical impulse will actually travel down one cell and jump that gap. There's some chemicals or neurotransmitters in that gap that help that facilitate that communication and will jump that gap to the other cell. Well, what happens in Alzheimer's disease is there's two abnormal formations. This one right here that looks like a tumbleweed, that's made up of a very deadly protein called beta amyloid. Those are called senile plaques. And so basically those form around the outside of the cell and they destroy the connections. You can see how the branches of the cell are all being shriveled up so they can no longer communicate with their neighboring cells. Then over here, you can see inside this internal part of the cell looks very different from the healthy one. And as we'll be showing you from some microscopic images, inside here there's a formation of tangles. These are called Neurofibrillary Tangles. And we'll explain that a bit more. So here you can see a picture of a healthy brain on my left, and here, this is the same side view of the brain that you saw before in the earlier illustration. So the temporal lobe is right there. Whoops, excuse me. The temporal lobe is right here over the ear. You can see how the brain has all these hills and valleys, these folds, and how it's all nice and tight and compacted. Now look at this brain of a person with Alzheimer's disease, and again, this temporal lobe right over the ear, you can see all of the shrinkage or atrophy that's occurred, and that's all due to the loss of brain cells. And down here on the bottom, you can see normal brain tissue and tissue with plaques and tangles that we're going to show you in greater detail. So here on this slide, you will see the plaques, those tumbleweeds I showed you earlier. They're made up of that beta amyloid. Normally, our brain clears beta amyloid from our systems during sleep, as you're going to learn later. But in Alzheimer's disease, that clearance doesn't happen. Instead, the beta amyloid sticks around the cells and clumps around them, again, destroying these branches and making it impossible for the cells to communicate.
So as we get older, it takes us longer and longer to clear out this beta amyloid. So someone who is 80 probably takes 3 or 4 times as long to clear out the amyloid as someone who's in their 20s or 30s.
Meaning we need more sleep.
Well, we need to get good sleep.
Yeah.
So the other abnormality that Cordula mentioned are neurofibrillary tangles. And the senile plaques with the beta amyloid, they occur outside of the cell and they interfere with the communication at these dendrites. The neurofibrillary tangles, which are made up of another abnormal form of a protein called tau, they actually occur within the neuron, and essentially they start to mess up this sort of communication system inside the cell, so the cell can no longer send nutrients and important information up and down the cell to keep it alive. So it's a combination of these senile plaques with amyloid and neurofibrillary tangles with the tau that are causing the cells to die.
So we're going to just take a moment to explain what biomarkers are. We're going to be using that term. A biomarker is actually some type of biological factor that you can measure that indicates that a disease is present even though you're not having any symptoms. So a biomarker for heart disease, two primary biomarkers actually are cholesterol, right? And high blood pressure. Both of those indicate that we're at risk for heart disease. Now, when we go into the doctor, we don't first get diagnosed with cardiovascular disease once we have a heart attack or a stroke, do we? It's way back when your doctor notices these abnormalities in blood tests, in your cholesterol or in your blood pressure, that the red flag goes up and says, oops, there's some markers that suggest this person is at risk for cardiovascular disease. Well, and blood sugar level or blood glucose level would be the same kind of biological marker, only in this case for diabetes. Well, in Alzheimer's disease, we also have two biological markers that we're beginning to be able to measure, and those are the beta amyloid that we've mentioned and the tau. And a very important point is that Alzheimer's disease has a long silent phase, just like heart disease. When you're having issues with cholesterol and hypertension, and you don't have that heart attack or stroke, well, the same thing with Alzheimer's disease. You're having biological changes going on, but you're not having any symptoms yet that are noticeable to others. So there's two ways of measuring beta amyloid and tau, and those are either with cerebral spinal fluid, so a spinal tap, or actually new imaging techniques. There are new brain imaging techniques that can pick up amyloid in your brain, and we're going to show you that.
So there are investigators at various universities, including UCI, that are trying to look for other ways that are perhaps less non-invasive than a spinal tap to measure amyloid and tau levels. So there's investigators looking at, can we detect from particular blood analysis these biomarkers? So hopefully in the future there may be ways that a doctor can just draw your blood and tell you if there's a risk or not, but we're not there yet. But most of the evidence that we've found about these biomarkers has come from either CSF fluid, which is obtained, or these imaging studies. And cerebral spinal fluid is a clear water-like substance. In fact, about 99% of it is just water. But it is a substance that's produced in the very sort of, these sort of cavities or ventricles in the brain. And I'll just hold up the model. So this is a cavity, a lateral ventricle, and there's some other little cavities which you probably can't see, but this spinal fluid is produced in those cavities, and it's pumped out of the cavity, and it sort of flows around the spinal cord and also around the brain, and so it sort of washes through the brain and around the brain. It's primarily there for protection. sort of provides a cushion, so as you move your head around, your head doesn't bump against the skull. But another important function is that it helps to wash away waste products, products that come from just the normal life and death of the cells. And to get a measure of amyloid and tau, one way the doctors can do it is by doing this lumbar puncture or a spinal tap. And essentially what happens is that the individual, it's an outpatient basis test, takes about 45 minutes to an hour or a little longer. But the individual comes in and usually they're reclining on a little table, or they can be bent over, sitting down. The neurologist will typically numb the skin, and then they'll insert a very fine needle. It's about the same width as a piece of hair. And that needle will go between the vertebrae into the spinal column, and then fluid will gradually leak out into a little receptacle that we'll take and we'll be able to measure. The amount of fluid taken out is very small. The total amount of spinal fluid that you have in your brain is probably about 9 ounces. It wouldn't even fill a Coke can. And the amount of fluid that is taken out is about the equivalent of a tablespoon. And your body replenishes this spinal fluid about 4 times during the course of the day. So the amount of fluid that is taken out is very small, and usually within about an hour you've replaced it. Most people don't have any side effects. If they have an effect, it's usually where they might get a headache if they get up too quickly. So typically after you've had a spinal fluid test, you lie down there for about 45 minutes or an hour. And then you can get up and you rarely have any side effects. What do we look at? What do scientists look at? Well, they look at the levels of amyloid and tau. Beta amyloid is the substance that occurs outside of the cells, and tau is from the tangles. And this is just an illustration of what type of pattern you might see in a normal adult versus an Alzheimer's patient. And so in someone who has Alzheimer's disease, in red, what you find is low levels of beta amyloid. Why might that be? You would think that, well, if they're producing a lot of amyloid in the brain, we should see high levels. But remember, we said the amyloid is sticking in the brain. It's forming these tangles. So someone who has Alzheimer's disease, plaques, someone who has Alzheimer's disease, they don't show much amyloid in their spinal fluid because most of it is stuck in the brain. A normal adult, those plaques, that amyloid is gradually washed away, goes into the spinal fluid, and then gets essentially broken down and dissolved. Tau is for the tangles, which is indication of the death or the degeneration of neurons. So if you have a lot of cells that are dying because of these tangles, fluid is washing over them, you're going to get a lot higher levels of tau in the spinal fluid. So that's why in an Alzheimer's patient you see high levels of tau compared to a normal, and low levels of amyloid. So that's sort of the pattern that the doctors are looking for. These plaques and tangles, as we mentioned earlier, they start in the hippocampus and the temporal lobe, and then over time they start to spread backwards into the parietal lobes that are involved in language and visual spatial skills towards the back of the head, and then also into the front portion of the brain, which is involved in what we call executive skills, like judgment, planning, decision-making, organization. A lot of the higher level skills we do in the course of a day. The other method that is used in a lot of research settings is to do an amyloid Pet scan. And in an amyloid Pet scan, what happens is a radioactive substance is attached to a chemical that will latch on to the amyloid in the brain. And you can inject this substance, and the amyloid sort of shows up as these bright red and yellow colors. So this is a scan of an adult with amyloid deposition. These are just different views of the brain. And this is of a normal, healthy control where there's very little amyloid. So these two ways we can see amyloid, and just in the last year or two, there's another type of scan called a Tau scan, which allows us to see tangle formation. So these are very novel and new techniques. They're not generally available to the public, but they are used in research and clinical trials. Hopefully in the future, as we learn more and more about how to interpret these scans, they will be available for individuals in other fields besides research.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about how Alzheimer's disease progresses, moving from what we consider normal cognitive aging all the way through dementia. So basically, we look at Alzheimer's disease as occurring in 3 different phases. The first phase is what we call that preclinical phase or silent phase. That's when these biomarker changes are occurring, but there's no evident symptoms. The second phase is mild cognitive impairment, when the person is starting to have symptoms, but they're still functioning well. The third phase is dementia, when the person's symptoms are worsening and the person becomes dependent on others, is no longer able to function. So we'll go into this in a little bit more detail. So in terms of normal aging, we're all going to experience some cognitive changes, some changes in our memory and thinking abilities. And this slide just lists some of the common ones. Now I should say that all of these slides that you're going to see now, they're all formatted the same, with the horizontal line representing the time that's passing in years, and the vertical line representing the decline in cognitive ability. So here, we just think about a normal, healthy young adult as that straight line, okay? What this is showing you is that as we get older, we all have a few changes, and so that line is just a little bit lower than what it would be for a younger person. Now, each one of us is different in terms of how many of these changes we experience as well. That varies from person to person. But in general, it takes us longer to process new information and to learn new information. We have to apply more effort. So when we meet new people, we might have difficulty remembering their names unless we really focus and work at it, or we might need to meet them a few times, or we might need to rehearse their names or use other strategies. We're going to be a lot more susceptible to distraction. So I always like to tell the story when I was young. Grew up on a little farm in Oregon, and we were quite poor, and so the room where I had my desk and studied was also the room where we had the family TV. But when I was young, 14 or 15 years old, I could just put up a little shell around myself and focus and study and not be annoyed or distracted by the television. Do you think I could do that today? Not in a heartbeat. If I've got talking going on in the background, I do okay with classical music these days, but beyond that, I'm more distractible. It takes a little bit more effort to recall information, and also sometimes it's a little bit difficult to find a word that you're looking for, so wouldn't be surprised if some point during this presentation I go, what was that word? But then what happens? 10 or 15 minutes it comes back to me, right? That's normal. And also, we can't multitask as easily. we need to focus on one thing at a time. So these are all very common and normal changes.
The next change is called the preclinical or asymptomatic change phase. And this is where gradually over time, those biomarkers, the beta amyloid and the tau, are starting to form in the brain, causing the cells to become sicker and to die. In the preclinical phase, there's no obvious symptoms going on. There's these changes going on in the brain, but they're not showing up in terms of any kind of memory problems or thinking difficulties or difficulties in their activities of daily living. This preclinical phase can last for decades before any symptoms become evident. So just like a person can have problems with their cholesterol, it's gradually building up in your arteries. Over time, there's no symptoms until it reaches such an extent that it clogs the artery and you have a heart attack, or if it's in the brain, you have a stroke. So this preclinical phase is usually where there's no symptoms, or there could be a very mild symptom, which is sometimes referred to as subjective cognitive decline. And this is where the person has some complaints about memory loss, typically. But this is more than just simple forgetting, like where you placed your car keys, or you forgot the name of somebody you know and you've just met again but can't retrieve it. This is more like where you're forgetting how to do things that you're familiar doing. So for example, you're familiar at cooking a particular recipe and it's your sort of forte, but now you're having trouble remembering what are the ingredients and the amounts. Or you're very good at using a particular tool, but now you can't sort of remember how to use it or operate it. So this is more than just simple forgetfulness, but it's at a level where if you went to your doctor and you said, well, I'm really concerned about my memory, the doctor might give you some tests and they would say you scored in the normal range, you're fine. So this is a stage where the person knows something is going on, but the doctors aren't able to really detect it. This occurs in about 12% of older adults. And we know that in this certain group of these individuals are at a higher risk of subsequently developing into mild cognitive impairment in the next stage and also dementia. In fact, persons with subjective cognitive decline are about 4 times greater risk of converting to more serious cognitive impairment within a short span of time, a few years. You need to keep in mind, however, that complaints about memory can also be due to a lot of other causes. It could be due to things like depression, medication. So not all memory problems means that you have subjective cognitive decline or at risk.
All right, well, if you do go on to progress, the next stage is mild cognitive impairment. And mild cognitive impairment is when you do show symptoms. You're showing significant, noticeable symptoms. They're noticeable to you, they're noticeable to others around you. You might be forgetting appointments repeatedly. And so about 15 to 20% of all individuals aged 65 and older have MCI. And they complain of memory or a problem in another area of thinking, like language, visual spatial abilities. And these individuals, if they're given cognitive tests, they score in the lowest 10% of their peers. So people in the same age bracket. And at this point, however, the problems in memory and thinking aren't interfering with their ability to function. They can still take care of their own personal care, they can still groom, they can still dress, so they're able to function independently. Now, again, MCI, just like subjective cognitive decline, increases your risk for progressing on, but not everybody with MCI will progress on. Studies have found that anywhere from 32 to 40% of people with MCI will progress on within the next 5 years. But it's also very interesting that about 15 to 20% even improve or just remain stable across time. So now, again, if the person progresses on, they progress into this last phase, which is dementia. And at this point, the person is having problems with multiple cognitive abilities. It's starting to affect them globally. They're having greater and greater dependence on others for help with everyday things that cannot be left unsupervised. They start to develop behavioral changes that put them at risk, such as walking away or becoming very agitated. So you can see within dementia, there are also these stages of mild, moderate, moderately severe, and severe.
I think it's useful just to give a quick illustration of someone progressing through these stages. So let's take, for example, a salesman who in his best days, when he is normal, he's able to remember the needs of maybe his top 30 or 40 clients. And he can also remember things like the names of their family members and what their interests are. If this individual starts to develop a problem, he would go into that first phase, the preclinical phase, where perhaps now he's realizing that my memory's not as good as it used to be. So instead of being able to spontaneously come up with the names of all of his clients and what they like, he's now having some difficulty and he has to write it down. He has to consult like a little notepad when the client comes to tell him what the last purchases were. He might know there's a problem, but his coworkers don't. They look like he's functioning quite normally. Over time, if it goes into mild cognitive impairment, now the coworkers are noticing the problem. They're noticing he's not able to perform his job. He's much more forgetful. He's not coming to meetings. He's forgetting how to do certain things that he always did, like calculating the costs. He still might be able to stop at the grocery store and pick up the items on the way home, and by using a calendar, he's able to keep track of his bills. So his functioning isn't greatly impaired, but there's a definite problem going on. If he continues on into the dementia stage, well, now the problem is very obvious and he's no longer able to function independently. So he's probably had to retire. He's needing assistance with paying bills, shopping, etc. And then if it goes into the dementia, it will progress over time, varying from individual to individual, but it will be a progressive problem.
All right, well, how long does this whole process take? Well, first of all, remember, you can have biological changes for 15 or 20 years before you ever see a symptom. But once you see a symptom, how long does it take? Well, this slide basically summarizes here that MCI lasts anywhere from 5 to 8 years. So it takes from 5 to 8 years for it to progress on to dementia. And then the dementia itself can span another 5 to 8 years. So we're talking about another potentially as much as 16 years. So I've just described a disease that you could have for 40 years. That's how long Alzheimer's disease takes from its beginnings to a full-blown dementia.
So in other words, we always talk about Alzheimer's being more common in people over age 65, but the very beginnings of it may have been when a person is 35 or 40 in midlife, when those biomarkers start starting to change.
So in other words, I always say I could have Alzheimer's disease right now and not know it. Because right now there isn't a way for my doctor to measure it before I actually have symptoms. All right, so there's a lot of causes of cognitive impairment. We want to make sure that you understand that because we don't want you to jump into conclusions of thinking, oh, just because I'm having some memory or thinking issues, that means I have dementia. So when we talk about that dementia phase, this is really just kind of summarizing a bit of what we've talked about. That dementia phase really involves losing intellectual functioning, it affecting multiple cognitive abilities, and the impairment being so severe that you can't function on your own. Alzheimer's disease is far and away the major cause of dementia. And you can see here, it's the largest under that big umbrella of dementia, accounting for 60 to 80% of cases. As we've said, the MCI is a transitional phase between what we consider normal cognitive aging and Alzheimer's disease or another dementia. And we can have dementia again for many reasons, as Malcolm's going to summarize.
So as Cordula says, just because a person has a memory problem doesn't mean it's Alzheimer's disease. There's many causes. Some of the causes of memory loss are reversible. For example, they could include things like depression and anxiety, metabolic problems like thyroid difficulties, vitamin deficiencies like vitamin B12, vitamin D deficiency. So some of these are reversible if you identify them and treat them. Others are static or non-progressive. So for example, someone who's been in a car accident and has significant head trauma, they may come out of that as a result with some problems with their thinking, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get worse over time. And then there are the progressive or irreversible dementias, and there's a large number of them, but the major one that affects most people are Alzheimer's disease. There's other disorders such as Lewy body, Parkinson's disease dementia, frontal temporal dementia, and a lot of what are called Parkinson plus disorders. But the most common one is Alzheimer's, and that's the focus of our study, our presentation.
There could be a lot of different causes for symptoms of memory and thinking difficulties. And when you go in to get a diagnosis, the doctor is looking at all these possible. If you could excuse me and please stop conversing, I'm sorry, we need to move on or we are not going to get through the material. And I know when we don't get through the material, the evaluations say you didn't get through the material. So come be with me, please. All right, so we're going to do an evaluation to look at what all the possible causes are. So contributing factors might be mental health issues, delirium, might be metabolic disorders, sensory impairments, nutritional factors, some kind of trauma, brain tumor, infections, or substance use. So in a full clinical evaluation, and we have skipped ahead in the slides because we know that we need to move ahead. We're going to have, many of you asked me about this, and so if you're concerned about your memory and thinking, probably the first thing you're going to do is go to your PCP and mention that, and your PCP is going to give you a screening. And if that screening, that short screening, turns out positive, meaning there's something significant going on, there's a red flag, then you would want to have a full evaluation.
And the full evaluation includes doing a detailed medical history, doing a physical or neurological exam. That would be like detecting signs of stroke or tumors or things like Parkinson's disease. It would also include doing blood work and maybe a urinalysis to determine, is there an infection going on? Are there deficiencies in certain vitamins? Brain imaging is often a part of a comprehensive assessment, and that would look for things like stroke or atrophy or shrinkage in the brain. And then also there would be some cognitive testing that would look and see, is there really a memory problem there, or is this someone who is just concerned about their memory? Are there really language or visual spatial or executive deficits present? So the biomarkers we talked about aren't part of the standard assessment, and hopefully in the future they will be, but right now they're not part of it.
All right, we're going to talk just briefly about treatments that are available. And I'm just going to say this slide provides a summary of the history of drug development for Alzheimer's disease. The most important point was that the disease was first identified in 1906 by Dr. Alois Alzheimer, a German neuropsychiatrist. It was 1993, 90 years later, before we had the first medication, Cognex, which we no longer use because it has toxic liver effects. The next medication came in 1997, and then followed in 1999, 2001, 2003 is the last time the FDA approved a medication for Alzheimer's disease. Since then, we've had at least 244 experimental clinical trials trying to identify a new treatment for the disease.
So this is just a listing of the available drugs that are FDA approved for treatment of Alzheimer's disease. And essentially, what they're doing is they're producing a symptomatic treatment. So they're trying to boost up a person's memory or thinking abilities. They're not altering the disease course. And so these drugs have a beneficial effect in many individuals who take them, but it's a temporary benefit. It doesn't last. Usually within a number of years, the benefits will be lost.
All right, and we would like to have a treatment that actually slows the progression. So here, just to say, we can see at the current treatments, if this is the natural progression of the disease, the current treatments do boost up the person's functioning, but eventually they decline to the same point as they would if they weren't being treated. We'd like to have a drug that slows the progression of the disease, so actually modifies the disease course, or even better, that maintains a person as stable, or best would be that cure.
Well, why hasn't the drugs been successful? There's 244 drugs tested in the last decade. The failure rate is 99.7%. Why is that? Well, it's probably because these drugs are given far too late in clinical trials. It's like you take somebody who you're testing a drug for heart disease. The person already has had multiple strokes in the brain. They've got congestive heart failure, and now you're giving them a drug and you expect to see significant improvement. Well, there's too much damage already in the body to see the benefit. So what drug trials are doing, instead of starting a person on these experimental drugs when they're already in the dementia phase, they're moving forward. So a lot of the clinical trials now are looking at people who are in the MCI stage or in the pre-symptomatic stage. And I'll just mention two trials. One is called Emerge, and this is a drug where they're using, it's called a monoclonal antibody to attack the amyloid and remove it from the brain. And so these are some of the details about the trial. If you go to the next slide, Cordula. So this monoclonal antibody is called aducanumab, and instead of giving it to patients who are already demented, now they're using it in patients who have mild cognitive impairment and mild dementia. It's an injection you get once a month, and they're following individuals who are either getting the injection or they get a placebo, and they're looking in terms of, are there changes in the levels of amyloid in the brain? And they're measuring that through these amyloid Pet scans we showed you earlier, as well as through cognitive tests. And the idea is if we can remove the amyloid when a person is still in the early phases, maybe they won't progress into the dementia stage. Another trial that is being currently nationwide, but also at UCI, is called the A4 study. And the 4 A's stand for anti-amyloid treatment in asymptomatic Alzheimer's disease. And this is using another monoclonal antibody, solanezumab, where now we're giving it to individuals who are in the preclinical phase. These are where there's no symptoms present, but there is these biomarkers in the brain. So these are individuals who have had an amyloid Pet scan. They're showing amyloid and they're given this drug. And the idea is that over the course of essentially 3.5 years, where they come in once a month for an infusion, hopefully if the drug works, then these individuals will not progress from preclinical into MCI and dementia. So the focus of clinical trials now is not to be treating so much or trying the drugs with people in dementia stage, but to move earlier and earlier into the disease in the preclinical and MCI.
So we have listed here for you websites where you can get information about clinical trials. And you can also find out more information from the UCI Mind folks here tonight about involvement in clinical trials. So now we're going to focus on those 5 key strategies to reduce your risk for Alzheimer's disease. And so these are the 5 that we're going to really focus on. We have a few other tips at the end. The first one has to do with controlling cardiovascular disease and diabetes. We'll talk about the importance of a healthy diet, exercise, mentally stimulating activity, and staying socially active. So to begin, we'll talk about cardiovascular risk factors. And we've mentioned what those are already tonight: high blood pressure and high cholesterol. So 1/3 of people in the United States have high blood pressure. And when we talk about blood pressure, you go into your doctor, you all know there are 2 numbers that you get. There's that top number and the bottom number. The top number represents your systolic blood pressure. That's when your heart is pumping, contracting, pushing out the blood. The bottom is the diastolic blood pressure, and that's your heart at rest in between beats. Now, as this chart shows you, what we consider the cutoff for normal blood pressure is 120/80. We also know that your blood pressure and what is good for you is an individual discussion with your doctor, because now some of the research is showing that for the oldest old, people over 90, having slightly elevated blood pressure is maybe a good thing, because their heart has to pump harder to get blood into those tiny vessels in the brain. So always have that conversation with your doctor about what's the right number for you to shoot for. Now, there have been numerous studies over the, I would say, last 15 years or so that have consistently shown that high blood pressure increases your risk for dementia anywhere from 3 to 5 times. And specifically for any type of dementia, 5 times, and for Alzheimer's disease, about 3 times. And the higher that top number is, the higher that systolic blood pressure is, the more at risk you are. So you can see if you treat it, and there have been studies showing that people who are effectively controlling their blood pressure with antihypertensive medications can actually lower their risk for dementia. They can offset that risk.
The other cardiovascular risk is your cholesterol. And most people, if they go to their doctor, they get it at least once a year or maybe every 6 months, they'll get a cholesterol test. And they're looking at total cholesterol and 2 types of cholesterol, the LDL, which is the bad cholesterol, or we call it lethal here, and HDL, which is a healthy or good cholesterol. And the bad cholesterol, the LDL, is the cholesterol that sort of adheres to the walls of your arteries, that causes a blockage and a narrowing. And the HDL is the good cholesterol that essentially sweeps away that bad cholesterol, taking it to the liver where it's processed and gotten rid of. And we know from a number of studies that having elevated cholesterol, particularly in midlife, this greatly increases 2 to 3 times the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease dementia in later life. And if you have a combination of high blood pressure and high cholesterol, then the risk is even greater.
So we want to mention diabetes. You're probably all aware that diabetes is at epidemic proportions, and we attribute a lot of that to the problem we have with obesity in our society right now. Now, diabetes has a lot of negative consequences that you may be familiar with. One that you may not be as familiar with is that it actually increases your risk for cognitive impairment, and specifically for dementia. Now, again, this has been studied for a long time, so this slide shows you 2 basically reviews of the literature. The first one looked at 16 studies, and they summarized these studies, and they found that diabetes increased your risk for dementia 1.5 times, and specifically for vascular dementia 2.5 times. So it seems that diabetes is more linked to vascular dementia than other types of dementia. In the second study, also a review, in this case looking at 14 studies involving 2.3 million persons, the diabetes increased risk by 60%. Now, what this study revealed that was interesting was that risk was greater for women than for men. Now, diabetes in and of itself can produce some cognitive impairment. That's not dementia. And one of the theories is that because diabetes in and of itself makes you vulnerable to some cognitive impairment, that it also makes you more susceptible to developing a dementia, okay? It increases your risk in that way. So it also increases risk for conversion from MCI to dementia. Remember we said not everybody with MCI will move on with dementia. Well, that's more likely to happen if you have diabetes. So now we want to shift to a healthy diet. So what's weight got to do with it? For many, many years, the research that looked on at the relationship between weight and developing a dementia pretty consistently said it's just bad to be overweight or obese. It increases your risk. Now, newer studies are showing a different pattern. The first ones, and these are both really large studies. This one included 450,000 some persons. And they looked at the decade of your life in which you were obese and your risk for developing dementia, and specifically Alzheimer's disease. And you can see people who were obese at age 30 to 39 had 3.5 times greater risk. Now, if you follow those decades, you can see with every decade, if you're obese, the risk is going down. And by the time you're age 70 to 79, if you're obese, kind of doesn't make a difference. It's not increasing your risk by that point. And when you get to 80 to 89, actually people that are overweight and obese are at decreased risk. Interesting pattern, huh? Well, the second study showed a similar concern about being underweight, or related concern about being underweight. So here they looked at 2 million individuals in primary care. They were basically middle-aged. They were obese, and, and they looked at the ones that were obese, and look at that. They had a lower risk than those at a healthy weight, versus those who were underweight were at greater risk. So I think the general thought right now is that as we grow older, a little extra weight is protective, but realize this also isn't a license to be obese, because obesity increases your risk for heart disease, increases your risk for diabetes. What do heart disease and diabetes do? They increase your risk for dementia, right? So, but it does say you gotta be cautious about being underweight, and that we need to maintain a healthy weight throughout our lives. In terms of diets, there are two diets we're going to mention today. The first is the Mediterranean diet. I'm sure you've all heard a lot about that. It's a very popular diet right now. And the research is consistently showing that adhering to a Mediterranean diet can reduce your risk for developing dementia. And there are two studies there that reflect that. And you know that a Mediterranean diet focuses on whole grains, fruits, vegetables. We're getting our oil from olive oil. We can drink a little wine. What are we staying away? We're eating fish regularly. We're staying away from sweets. We're staying away from red meat. We're staying away from a lot of saturated fats.
There's another diet, and we included a flyer, a handout in your list of slides, and this is called the MIND, or the Mediterranean Diet for Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay, or MIND. And this is very similar to the Mediterranean diet. It has 10 major food groups. They include the leafy vegetables, nuts, whole grains, use of olive oil, fish at least once a week, berries. And the diet was essentially selected because research had showed the particular components of the diet could have neuroprotective effects. And they did an interesting study. This was involving 960 older adults who they followed for about 5 years. And they gave them food surveys, and they asked them during the 5 years, what kind of diet are you eating? And then they looked at the relationship between people who followed the MIND diet and their risk for cognitive impairment and dementia 5 years later. And what they find is that the people who adhered quite closely to the MIND diet, they had a 53% reduced risk of developing dementia 5 years later. Those people who followed the diet, but not quite perfectly, so they were a little flexible in what they eat, they had a 35% reduced risk of developing dementia. And also those people who followed the diet had better cognitive functioning. In fact, they compared the people who followed it well to those who just followed the standard Western diet, and the people who followed it well, they were essentially functioning as someone about 7.5 years younger than their stated age. So eating the healthy diet made you think younger and also lowered your risk. One of the components of that diet is fish. And so there's a number of studies showing that people who eat fish at least once a week, they have up to a 60% lower risk for developing dementia.
So, of course, one of the biggest concerns about fish are the contaminants. And, you know, there are some exceptions in terms of dietary cautions having to do with children and women who are pregnant. But if you're concerned about contaminants, the best way to get rid of contaminants in fish is just to skin the fish. 40%, I believe, of all contaminants are actually in the skin. So skin the fish before you cook it. You do need to cook this in a healthy way to get the benefits. And there are many sites where you can go online to look at the healthiest fish. The one I just picked out here is www.mercury.org. Also, it's really important when you shop for salmon to look at where it's raised. Farm salmon that's from South America generally has the lowest PCB levels. So now just a word about vitamins and supplements. Basically, the bottom line people always ask us is, if I don't like fish, can I just take fish oil pills and will it be just as good? If I don't get enough vitamin C from my food, can I just take vitamin C and will that do the trick? Well, guess what? The research is pretty contradictory about the use of supplements as a substitute for food. In fact, some studies have shown that the actual food is more beneficial than the supplements, and the supplements don't have an equivalent effect. But that research goes back and forth and is still in progress. So it is really important to get your nutrients from foods as much as you possibly can. Supplements are supplements, they're not substitutes for getting your nutrients from foods. Also, you have to be very attentive to the fact that supplements have many side effects. One listed on the slide has to do with vitamin E being a blood thinner. So if you're taking Coumadin, could interact negatively with that. The other thing is we know vitamin E might increase risk for increased risk for death in people with coronary heart disease. So always talk to your doctor before starting supplements. And you know, we've always looked for an elixir. On the left side of the slide, you see an image of brain salt from 1892, which you probably cannot read the type or the print on the bottle. Says it was for seasickness, brain troubles, headaches, nervous disability, sleeplessness, excessive studying, mania, and overbrain work. I suffer from the last one, overbrain work. But these days, we still are looking for the elixir. We're looking for the elixir for memory problems. And so you can go on the internet, you know, and you can find a lot of these elixirs, but the point is they are just elixirs that, as Malcolm's going to say, we don't know what's really in them, and there is no actual scientific proof that any of these benefit your memory, and you can spend a lot of money on them.
That's true, because they all advertise as, quote, helping to maintain brain health or improve cognition, attention, memory, but there's really no solid proof in well-done studies, and the type of studies that need to be done are ones that we do in clinical trials where they're double-blind, placebo-controlled, randomized trials where you have a placebo versus a treatment, and the doctors and the families don't know what they're getting. A lot of these supplements are in very small trials where the person knows what they're getting, and so there's not accurate data collected. There's a lot of positive testimonials that you'll see in advertisements. Rarely do you see an advertisement that has a negative testimonial, saying, well, I spent $60 for 2 months, I had nothing benefited. They don't show that. They only show the positive testimonials, but you have to be very suspicious about these, and as Cordula said, they can be very costly. Just as an illustration, there was a study done by the National Institute of Health. It's called the GEM or Ginkgo Study. And this was a study that involved almost 3,000 older adults, some who had mild cognitive impairment. They were in their late 70s, and they followed them for 6 years, where every 6 months they did a comprehensive testing of the individual in terms of their cognitive abilities. And over those 6 years, they were interested in seeing how many of these people taking ginkgo biloba, which is a very common supplement. You see it in vitamins, you see it in smoothies that you can buy. But the idea is this ginkgo, which is sold as a way of improving memory and attention, would it actually help these older adults and reduce their risk of developing dementia? Well, at the end of 6 years, they looked to see how many developed dementia, and in the ginkgo group, it was 17.9%. In the group given a placebo for 6 years, it was 16.1%. So absolutely no difference between the groups, the group taking ginkgo versus the group taking just a sugar pill. And moreover, the ginkgo didn't help those with their memory or their attention or their cognitive abilities. So some of these supplements, they may have a lot of advertisement and a lot of positive testimonials, but there's no conclusive evidence that they do anything.
All right, so now we're going to talk about moving. Moving is about one of the most important things you can do for your brain is exercising regularly. Now, I thought it was about time we had a cartoon, so, you know, some of us are couch potatoes and we're raising rug spuds. And the sad thing is that we know that at least 13% of Alzheimer's disease cases worldwide are due to sedentary behavior.
A very recent study that was just published, I think in the last month or two, this was looking at, they did a meta-analysis where they're looking at 36 well-done studies on the benefit of exercise. And the high points of that study is shown here. So these were people 50 years of older, and they were cognitively healthy, or some had MCI, and they were essentially looking for the benefits of exercise in terms of their cognitive functioning. And what they found is that to achieve an improvement in your cognitive scores, individuals had to exercise for 45 to 60 minutes. It had to be of moderate intensity, and it had to be on most days of the week, like 5 days or more. Interestingly, in their meta-analysis, they looked at people doing aerobic exercise. This would be like walking, cycling, treadmill, versus strength training, versus Tai Chi. And they found no difference among the three groups. So doing any of those kinds of exercise of a moderate intensity, multiple days of the week, seemed to be beneficial in terms of the cognitive functioning. And the cognitive improvements were seen in memory, attention, and these executive functions like planning, organization, multitasking. So exercise seemed to improve cognition in normal adults and people with MCI.
And so, again, this next study is making some of the same points regarding exercising and, you know, again, getting your heart rate up and looking at the level of physical activity. So for older adults, 70 to 80, doing moderate to vigorous physical activity for 5 years or more, we're at 40% less risk for Alzheimer's disease. So this again was comparable to recommendations for exercise, 150 minutes, which is about, what, 20 to 30 minutes most days of the week. And in this additional points here, we can see that those who had very little physical activity had more cognitive decline than those with a lot of physical activity.
Well, you might ask yourself, well, why would exercise reduce your risk of developing dementia? And why would it also lead to improved cognition? Well, we've known for 50 plus years that exercise is good for your heart health. It improves your cardiovascular function. It helps to lower bad cholesterol, raises the good cholesterol. It helps to manage diabetes. You get improved blood flow to the brain. But more recently, studies have shown that when you exercise, your brain releases a growth hormone. It's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, and that growth hormone helps to get rid of amyloid in your brain. So we talked earlier about the formation of amyloid in the plaques. Well, if exercise can help to reduce that, that would help to explain some of the benefits we see in cognition and reduced dementia risk.
Well, there aren't a whole lot of studies that look at the impact of combining strategies, but this one study looked at the impact of combining a healthy diet with exercise. And so you could see that the greatest benefit was for people who were doing exercise plus diet. Yes, being physically active was beneficial, reducing your risk by 33%. If you only ate the Mediterranean diet, that was 40%. But if you did both, you had the greatest benefit. Also, I forgot this point up here. You can really help reduce your risk by being active throughout your life. This is a lifestyle that we want, that you adopt over your entire life. So we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of staying cognitively active as well. And here, just a little bit about getting away from the TV. There's actually 2 studies that have looked at television viewing. The older study here, interestingly, interviewed older adults who had Alzheimer's disease. So this was either the person with the disease or the caregiver who reported how much time that individual with the disease spent watching TV. How much of their leisure time were they sitting in front of the television? Well, guess what? Those people who developed Alzheimer's disease were spending 27% of their leisure time in front of the TV compared to the healthy older adults who had only been spending about 18% of the time. So, but the more those individuals increased their, or substituted TV viewing with cognitively or intellectually stimulating activity, that helped to reduce that risk again. Now, the second study, which is very recent from last year, actually followed 18 to 30 years olds for 25 years. And they looked at how these individuals function cognitively. And the ones who in midlife had poor cognitive functioning, there were 2 characteristics about those individuals. One was they watched TV for 3 or more hours a day. The second was that they didn't do much physical activity, right? So instead of spending that 3 hours in front of the television, it was important to get out and move. So many people ask us all the time, well, what kind of activity should I do? I do these things around the house, like the ones that are listed on the slides. I like crossword puzzles. I like, knitting or crocheting. Is that going to benefit my brain? Or do I have to go and take a special kind of memory training program? Well, guess what? Researchers looking at what they call leisure time cognitive activity, those things that are listed here, showed that participating in these could reduce risk by about 43%. So yes, staying cognitively challenged with something as simple as a board game, doing a game on the computer can promote brain health. And what about being familiar and comfortable using the computer, specifically the internet, and using email? Well, actually, that can benefit your brain as well. This study, which looked at about 6,500 older adults across 8 years at 5 different points in time, they gave these older adults a word learning task, a list learning task, and that's where the researcher gives you a list of 10 words, lets you practice them 3 times to see how many words you remember, and then comes back a little bit later, 5 minutes later or 30 minutes later, and says, well, how many of those words do you remember now that we we talked about earlier. And they found that the folks that were very comfortable with using the computer in terms of the internet and the email did better on that particular, what we call delayed recall task, than the folks who didn't use the computer frequently, who weren't comfortable with it. So digital literacy may be actually good for our brains.
Well, as we mentioned when we talked about memory supplements, there's also a lot of interest in sort of brain games. These are activities that you can purchase on the internet, or you can purchase workbooks, etc., that require you to do brain games. And the idea here is that by doing the brain games, it might help to maintain your cognitive functioning and possibly reduce the risk of developing a cognitive impairment. Well, you have to be very cautious about these, just like you have to be cautious about the brain supplements, because there's not a lot of proof that these will, for example, reduce the risk of developing cognitive impairment or dementia. In fact, in 2016, Luminosity, which is one of the big makers of these brain games, was fined by the Federal Trade Commission for $2 million for essentially making unsubstantiated claims about how doing these brain games can reduce the risk for developing cognitive impairment. So the evidence is that if you do brain games, that practice is going to help you do similar brain games. So your scores will get better, but it doesn't mean that your scores in your general cognitive functioning are going to improve. There is some evidence that doing these brain games, particularly tasks that require the quick or rapid processing of visual information, might actually boost an older adult's driving skills. So there is evidence for that, but there's no evidence that doing these will reduce your risk of developing MCI or dementia.
So just a word about staying socially active. Staying socially active and feeling socially supported is so important for your brain health. There's actually a list of 4 studies here that all demonstrate that having a good social support network, staying connected to people, feeling supported by others is good for your brain health, that reduces your risk for cognitive impairment and dementia. And in fact, just the other day, within the last couple of days, I saw another study come across my desk in my email that showed that individuals who have positive family support and also from close friends are at less risk for dementia than people who have negative support. So social support, being part of a place like Lakeview Senior Center, coming and hanging out, getting involved, playing bridge here, going to the exercise classes, all those things are so good for your brain. So, Lakeview Senior Center is a good place to do all this stuff together, actually, which we want to encourage you to do, is to adopt multiple of the strategies we've been talking about. We also just want to mention there really are some other things. The 5 that we talked about are like the big 5, but there's some other important ones to mention. One of them is head trauma. You've all heard the stories about football players, right? And how concussions or subconcussive injuries can increase risk for dementia. But even a head trauma coming from a fall for an older adult can increase your risk for dementia. So protecting yourself from falls is very important for your brain.
And interestingly, older adults who have an ApoE4, the gene we talked about, if they have a fall and a significant head injury, their risk for subsequent developing dementia goes up 7 times.
So a second one is stress. Stress actually has chronic stress, has a negative impact on the brain. Go way back to the beginning or early in tonight's lecture when we showed you the hippocampus. So it can actually cause the hippocampus to shrink. And here is just one study of many that shows that chronic stress can increase your risk. And this was just done on women, this particular study. A third area that's important to pay attention to is mental health issues. There happens to be specific research on two specific mental health disorders. One is anxiety disorder that can increase your risk for dementia. So this is kind of a lifetime mental health issue, not just getting anxious once in a while. And the same is true actually of depression. There's a lot of research showing increased risk related to depression. You can see here, if you've had a lifelong struggle with depression, it can increase your risk by almost 4 times. If you first become depressed in late life, you can see it also can double your risk.
Another issue is getting a good night's sleep. Earlier we had talked about the cerebral spinal fluid, the water-like liquid that sort of bathes the brain and washes through the brain. And one of the important functions is the washing away of waste products. And one of the most important waste products that is washed away when we're in deep sleep are these fragments of amyloid. So we've talked about ways you can reduce amyloid. One of them was just, we mentioned exercise, but another way is getting a good night's sleep. And generally doctors are recommending that people should try to get somewhere between 7 to 9 hours of sleep, solid sleep at night. There's something called the Glymphatic System, which is where when you sleep, sort of the gap between your neurons opens up and fluid can sort of flow through that gap, washing away the amyloid. So it's important to get a good night's sleep, and if you have anything that interferes with sleep, such as having sleep apnea that's not treated, that can increase the risk for subsequently developing Alzheimer's disease dementia down the road.
That pretty much covers that point. Malcolm already mentioned earlier that as we grow older, it does take our brains longer to do that process of clearing out the amyloid. I just want to mention briefly the importance of stopping smoking, which we know is unhealthy for many reasons. It's also unhealthy for your brain. 14% of cases worldwide could be attributed to smoking. And then Malcolm's going to talk a little bit about the anticholinergic medicines.
Anticholinergic drugs, they're very commonly used. Many of them are over-the-counter drugs, such as used to treat cold and flu symptoms. There's many that are used to treat, say, problems with bladder leakage. And there's others that are used to treat sleeping difficulties. All of these have a substance, they're called anticholinergic drugs, and what they do is they interfere with the cholinergic nervous system. You remember when we showed you the current drugs that are used to treat Alzheimer's disease? These are working on the cholinergic system, trying to raise up the level of acetylcholine in the brain. These anticholinergic systems suppress the activity of the cholinergic system. So you're really counteracting what these drugs are trying to do. Multiple studies that have looked at individuals using anticholinergics on a long-term basis, they find an increased risk for developing cognitive impairment and dementia. And even short-term use of these drugs can have some effect. So if you take some of these common sleeping aids like Benadryl, ZQuil, Tylenol PM, Advil PM, that PM is where they have a particular drug called diphenhydramine, which is essentially Benadryl, and that puts you to sleep, but it also suppresses this cholinergic system, and long-term use of that, day after day, week after week, that can have negative effects on your brain functioning. So if you have problems with sleep, we would recommend not using one of these over-the-counter medications with diphenhydramine in it, but rather talk to your doctor, figure out why you're having difficulty sleeping, and maybe using some other supplement like melatonin, which is a more natural occurring substance and doesn't have these negative effects.
So again, just to wrap up, we're really going to encourage you to do these strategies together. And then we just want to mention again and reinforce what Chelsea said this morning is, excuse me, not this morning. I said at the beginning of the presentation, UCI Mind is the only state and federally funded Alzheimer's disease center in Orange County, and we're so fortunate to have it here as a resource for all of you. And we're going to encourage everybody. You can do one of three things. You can do one of the 3 8s, as they're called. You can advocate. So we need people to advocate, to support research funding, also to support services for families and for individuals affected. You can donate. Linda Scheck's here, Director of Development for UCI Mind, because we rely on funding from philanthropists and from the community to do innovative research, and you can participate in research. We need people who are willing to volunteer in research, and actually one of the biggest challenges to doing research is difficulty getting enough people to volunteer for research.
A large number of clinical trials, the reason that they take years and years to do is because of the difficulty in recruiting subjects into them. It's not like there are endless number of people just waiting to be enrolled. In fact, very few older adults actually participate in research projects. And if there was a mechanism that could help tie those individuals into potential research studies, that would greatly facilitate the advancement of science. And so UCI has what Chelsea mentioned earlier, what they call their C2C registry, or consent to contact. And you can go on the website and you can sign in with your email. And if you just give your email, then you will get flyers about research studies that are ongoing at the university, and these could be clinical trials, they could be research studies looking at diet or exercise. You can also add information about yourself, tell us a little bit about your history, and then various scientists and researchers at UCI can use that information to sort of tailor-made and figure out what clinical trials or research studies you might be eligible to do, and then they could contact you.
And Chelsea's back over there in that corner, as well as other UCI Mind staff who can answer any of your questions about research participation. So, you know, it is a few minutes after 7. We're going to ask you to complete your evaluation forms. We'll just take 1 or 2 questions from the audience, and then we will be here afterwards if people want to talk to us. Does anybody have a pressing question they'd like to ask? Yes?
Nowadays, I hear all the doctors, they say fat is very good for your brain.
Go ahead.
I hear all the doctors, they recommend fat is good for your brain and eat fat.
Fat is good for your brain. I don't think the evidence supports that. I think healthy fats, yes, olive oil, and I think omega-3s. Omega-3s are a form of healthy fat that is found in fish. Our brains actually don't make the DHA. We need it, the EPA, but the evidence doesn't show any benefit of saturated or unhealthy fats for the brain. So I think we need to differentiate in that way. Malcolm, anything? No? Yes? Oh, I'm sorry, I can run. Who else do we have?
I was just curious, you know, they did a skin punch because they're doing some of the stem cells?
No, one of the
our participants at the clinic, they were doing a study that looks essentially at can we grow stem cells from an individual's skin. And so what this particular study does is they take a very small, little, about the size of a half of a pea, piece of skin. It's taken to a laboratory, and we're seeing if we can actually produce stem cells from that piece of skin. The goal would be that if we can get derived stem cells from skin for that individual, and we can grow new stem cells, then the hope is that by somehow adjusting those cells, we could have them grow into different types of cells, like brain cells, liver cells, muscles, etc. So UCI has a stem cell and a regenerative cell program, which is one of the very few amongst the Alzheimer's disease centers, and that was the focus of that study. And right now they're just essentially growing cells, collecting data, but it'll probably be a few years from now before they know if they can, say, transplant those into a person's hippocampus and see if it could benefit them.
So one more, and then we probably need to stop. Anybody else have a question that they'd like to ask? Well, did you see somebody? Was there somebody on them? Yes, go ahead.
Getting back to supplements, what's the status of niacin?
Oh, niacin study, yeah.
Well, that's an interesting study, and we're actually just starting a study. It's called NEAT, N-E-A-T, at UCI and a couple of other centers, and Chelsea or Hong, who is over by the door there, they can tell you about the study, but essentially it's using a vitamin B3, niacinamide, to see if it will help prevent the damage and destruction that tau biomarker causes to brain cells. So the NEAT study is rather unique in that most clinical trials are focusing on ways to remove or prevent amyloid from forming into the plaques. Well, the NEAT study and the nicotinamide study is actually looking, maybe we should focus on tau and the neurofibrillary tangles, because the tau seems to be most closely associated with the death of the cells and cognitive impairment. So this study is actually just getting started, and I would recommend that if you want more information about the duration, to talk with Hong about that.
All right, well, we're going to stop for now. We just appreciate all your attention. Thank you in advance for filling out the evaluation forms, and if you haven't stopped by, do go stop by and see the exhibitors, because there are lots of wonderful services here in Orange County. All right, good night.